Hi, I'm Sarah Cowgill, along with Tim Donner, Andrew Moran, Dave Patterson, and Graham Noble. And this is the Conservative Five, Liberty Nation's online TV news program. On today's episode, Waging War in Real Time, we'll dig into the war in the Holy Land from political, diplomatic, and military angles, and the national security of the U.S. Join the C5 panel for Israel, Hell on Earth, for a status update, war and its impact on U.S. politics, to understand where the presidential candidates stand, and Israeli conflict and the danger of open borders, to assess the U.S. vulnerabilities. All this and more coming up in this episode of the Conservative Five. On Saturday, October 7th, the world was stunned by a well-coordinated and brutal attack on Israel by the terrorist group Hamas. At least 1,400 Israelis were confirmed killed in the assault, including 289 soldiers. In Gaza, officials say the death toll now stands around 3,000. Following the attack, Israel declared war on the militant Islamist group. In a region prone to swift destabilization, all eyes are focused on Israel and Gaza. Dave, there seemed to be a massive intelligence failure, unless I got this really wrong. Any idea what happened with the Mossad and the CIA?
I think that Mossad and the CIA did get caught flat-footed a little bit, obviously. But I think that you have to give credit where credit is due. Hamas operation was carefully planned and executed. And apparently only a very few in Gaza among Hamas foot soldier terrorists, even knew what was going to happen as they were doing it. They had excellent operations security. They struck quickly, taking out video surveillance with snipers and microwave towers with drones. So they eliminated eyes and ears almost immediately, as well as communications. And with the microwave towers gone and taken down, all of the ground sensors were offline. So they couldn't hear what was going on, and they depended on that. They struck on a holiday, when the Sabbath was ongoing and security and IDF forces were reduced. And so they really had this well planned out. They had detailed maps and diagrams of the buildings and a good understanding of which buildings they were going to target. They built up this rocket inventory, evidently over a long number of months. They had bulldozers breaking down the concrete wall once the surveillance, the cameras, and this listening equipment was disabled. And with that initial barrage of rockets, the Israel Defense Forces' attention was diverted. The bottom line here is, when you think about it, Hamas has demonstrated that it's really not capable of such intricate planning. And so, in my view, Iran and Russia are the prime suspects.
Graham, you've been on the ground for conflicts. What goes through the minds of the Israeli Defense Force? That's when we say IDF, just FYI. What do you have to tell yourself before you enter into a place like the Gaza Strip?
Well, this urban warfare, is what we used to describe as FIBUA, fighting in a built-up area, is the most dangerous form of warfare for any soldier, particularly when you're assaulting rather than defending. Because if you're defending an urban environment, you're defending, buildings and other structures. If Hamas knows what they are doing, then they can harden those buildings, or some of them at least, to make them incredibly time-consuming and incredibly costly in terms of lives, just to take one building. So when the IDF ground forces do move into Gaza, which at some point they're going to, right now they're softening it up with aerial bombardments or artillery bombardments and whatever. But when they do go in, it's going to be incredibly dangerous because, first of all, you've got IEDs, improvised explosive devices, which could be pretty much anywhere, and especially, obviously, in the inside of certain buildings that Hamas would know that the IDF want to capture. Those structures could be made into death traps. And then, of course, with these people, we're talking about zealots, we're talking about fanatics who are willing to give up their lives. So then you've got the possibility of suicide bombers, obviously, you've got the issue of snipers. So this is going to be an incredibly dangerous operation. And then, of course, if you're taking, say, sniper fire from a building, well, what do? Do you put a rocket-propelled grenade into that building and just destroy it? Well, Hamas are going to be using human shields probably. So then you've got the tragic collateral damage of killing possibly hostages or just kind of civilians. So yeah, the whole thing is actually pretty much a nightmare scenario to launch a ground invasion of Gaza, but I think it's inevitable that they will do.
So right now, you think they're going to stick in, just bombs from the air, assault from the air?
I personally think they can't afford to just do that, because they need to. They've kind of vowed. Unfortunately, Netanyahu, for better or worse, has vowed to eliminate Hamas, and they cannot do that just from aerial bombardment. They've actually got to send in ground troops. Obviously they'll be sending in tanks and everything. If they were, the only real way to do this without massive loss of life on the Israeli side would have been to basically, tell the Palestinians to evacuate Gaza within a certain amount of time, and then just level the whole place, quite frankly, turn it into a parking lot.
I think everybody on this panel, except for Andrew, has watched all of this go on for years, decades and decades. And Tim, that's where I want to bring you in. The Jewish state has always had a tenuous situation. I mean, they're surrounded by Arab states that just want to get rid of them completely altogether, gone. Historically speaking, is this the worst it's ever been?
Well, I think Americans cannot understand what it's really like to live on essentially a postage stamp-sized country surrounded by enemies. So imagine, and we're talking about more than 20 countries historically committed to the destruction of Israel. Imagine if we were surrounded by Mexico and Canada, who were committed to destroying the United States. And this is even worse because of the closer proximity of the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and hostile Muslim and Arab actors that surround Israel. I mean, I think it's stunning. You would have thought 50 years to the day after the Yom Kippur War of 1973, that Israel would have been on a state of high alert simply because of it being an important anniversary.
Yeah.
And they weren't. It was the 50th anniversary. And of course, originally we had the 6-day war back in 1967. And that is where Israel captured territories that became disputed, became basically the basis for all the hostilities that have followed. But I think most of us can see that when you displace a people and replace them with somebody else, this kind of conflict is inevitable, and it's been going on now for 75 years, since 1948. And the irony is that the United Nations was the one that created Israel, and yet it is the UN that really threatens Israel more than anything else, with anti-Israeli states ganging up on Israel. They're in a very tenuous situation. And it seems to me militarily that when all bets are off is when Hezbollah gets involved, because they have a much greater level of military sophistication and are funded by Iran. And when Hezbollah starts getting heavily involved in this conflict, which I think they will, that's when it's going to take it to even another level.
Are you predicting? I mean, I know it's a dicey situation, but are you predicting that this is a possible World War III entrance just from the Middle East?
I think we'd be having our heads in the sand to say that it couldn't be. In other words, yes, it definitely could be, because you're going to get involved all the big geopolitical forces in the world, the United States, the Russians, the Chinese. And look at the hostile reaction around the world, the shameful pro-Hamas protests You know, as I said, the only good thing about this conflict is that the people that would stand up there in the United States and around the world and support Hamas, we need to make a list because these people are subhuman to support the slaughter of innocents, which is what Hamas did. And yet that's what millions of people around the world are doing. It's shameful and yet unsurprising, isn't it?
You know,
Yeah.
I'd like to pick up on that point, elaborate a little bit slightly on what Tim just said there, because here's the way you look at it. This is the kind of left wing, progressive, pro Palestinian view of what has happened here. You know, the Palestinians, they're poor, they're downtrodden, they're oppressed. You know, they're virtually living in a big prison that the Israelis essentially created. Again, this is not my opinion. This is what, you know, left wingers would say. This is what pro-Palestinian supporters would say. You know, so they're so downtrodden, they're so deprived, they're living in such misery that you know, who can blame them for harboring this rage against Israel? And so for that reason, you know, you can't really condemn what Hamas did. Now, here's the problem. You think about that and you're saying, okay, so essentially you're saying that the ends always justify the means, even when the ends are, you know, raping and torturing and slaughtering innocent people. You've got to think people who have that mindset, they are capable of anything at all. And so, yes, I agree totally with you, Tim, is that, you know, we need to be making notes about who these people are, because they are basically saying that they are willing to condone political violence on a horrendous scale because it's justified because, oh, you know, we're poor and downtrodden and we deserve better.
And the thing is, a slaughter is all about slaughter. It's not about achieving a greater objective. The objective itself is to murder as many Jews as possible. It's not like they're doing it to grab territory. Yes, of course, they do want to restore Israel to Palestine, but they don't care about their people. If Hamas cared about their people, about the ordinary Palestinians, the innocent Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, they would not have unleashed this provocative attack, which is certain to result in the deaths of thousands of their own people. They don't care about their people.
I'm going to pivot a bit here on this. I don't think anybody's going to disagree that the Palestinian citizens aren't the problem. It's the terrorist organization that is the problem, and they're just in the way. But you know, I want to pivot over to Andrew. It's callous and maybe too early to tell, but aren't wars good for the economy in general, Andrew?
Well, I'm sure the military-industrial complex thinks it is. I'm sure Keynesians thinks it is. I'm sure, you know, Mitch McConnell, who recently said that the war in Ukraine is good for the U.S. defense business, I believe he also probably agrees with that. But this whole idea that war is good for the economy was debunked back in 1850 by French economist Frederick Bastiat. He wrote about the broken window fallacy, and that the idea of, you know, breaking shopkeepers' windows stimulates the economy because it ripples throughout the marketplace by having people spend more. It's asinine. It's completely ridiculous to think that benefits anybody at all. If you look at the broader financial markets, though, you know, you go back to the Yom Kippur War and you see how market reactions have been subdued over time. They've just become immune to conflicts in the Middle East. Energy markets, though, it's completely different, just based on the fact of how tight the global energy supply is right now. You know, Saudi Arabia is cutting production, OPEC's cutting production, Russia's cutting production. So any disruption, in the oil supply, any escalation of the conflict in Israel is going to inevitably lead to higher oil prices. What does that lead to? It leads to higher inflation. What does that lead to? The central bank having to raise interest rates. And what does that lead to? A greater cost of living. So this is creating a cascading effect for the global economy, particularly when it comes to inflation. Because not only do you have the war in Ukraine, now you have the war in Israel, and inevitably, perhaps you'll have the war between China and Taiwan, which will stretch the U.S. completely thin, more deficit finance spending, more aid, just more disruption to global trade. So overall, Tim, he says, the prospect of World War III, if that's the case, global economy is doomed if it wasn't already.
Well, I think it's a dicey situation. Even the smallest misstep can send the world spinning in a new and potentially devastating direction with all facets. We'll keep you posted as information becomes available, and thanks, panel. The presidential hopefuls have all weighed in on the Palestinian-Israeli war. Across the board, barring one extreme long shot, all have declared solidarity with Israel in one way or another. But we all know wartime breeds a different kind of voter. Whether war hawk or pacifist, there's a candidate delivering promises. The early reports were that Joe Biden did a pretty good job at the start of this conflict defending Israel. But will that stick? Tim?
Well, he is putting all his eggs in the pro-Israeli basket, much like he has done with Ukraine. He has thrown all his chips on the table in favor of keeping Ukraine in this war with Russia. So, look, he thinks that, I think he has a vision, does Joe Biden, of Henry Kissinger style shuttle diplomacy, where he can go back and forth between Israel and the friendlier Arab states in particular, and large ones like Egypt, and somehow negotiated at least a ceasefire, some sort of cessation of hostilities. And then that will benefit him politically, right? Because he'll be seen as a uniter, not a divider, right? To use the political terms. But he's got a real problem on his left, because by putting himself in a position to actually travel to Israel in wartime, he has, in a sense, acted provocatively towards the left flank of his own party and against many in the Democratic Party who support the Palestinian cause, which is the best way to put it, or the easiest way to put it, to make it not look as bad as it really is. So Biden, and I did a piece on LibertyNation.com about this, about how war with a president generally is going to take down his approval. It's going to make the president less likely to be reelected. Now, there are exceptions to it. Really, just one, though. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but he had already been elected 3 times. And Hitler was seen as a threat to the entire world. Mm-hmm. So that was different. But in almost every other case, you see where war has brought presidents low. And I think Biden sees that probability, especially in light of the fact that the Ukraine war had already begun. So now we're talking about war in Eastern Europe. We're talking about war in the Middle East. We're talking about China beating the drums of war over Taiwan. This is not something that helps a sitting president in general. And so, and the fact that he's been so straight down the line pro-Israel is going to cause some problems for him. Let's put it this way. I'd be surprised if this new conflict on top of the Ukrainian war, especially when compared to Donald Trump's record of no new foreign wars, of keeping North Korea contained, of keeping Putin in his box, in having Israel in a relatively tranquil state during the Trump years. The comparison of the 45th and 46th presidents from the basis of foreign policy and international standing is not going to benefit Joe Biden.
Well, Dave, and let's grow off of Tim's statement. Do Americans want hawks or doves in times of war? I mean, where does the country normally align themselves?
Well, comparisons are oftentimes odious, but it's like asking a cancer patient if they want a doctor or a ventriloquist. You want thoughtful, decisive leadership to defeat an enemy. And in wartime, I'm afraid those qualities are more likely to be found in a hawk. What Biden has that is going to be troubling for him is that he has started strong, he's burning bright, but where does he go from here? He put two carrier strike groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. Okay. And what are you going to do with them? You've got a Marine expeditionary force of about 2,000 that is designed to do expeditionary force things. Okay, so what are you going to do with them? Compare this again with Reagan, who, when he came into office, basically brought battleships back into fighting order. And when the problem happened in Lebanon, he put battleships there and shelled Hezbollah. I doubt that in the near term that Biden is going to take those kinds of decisive measures.
All right. Well, Graham, let's pivot to the GOP field. I mean, you got Nikki Haley. She seems pretty go-getter hawkish. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis has sounded pretty clear and forceful as well. But I mean, out of those two, who stands as one of the most able to deal with this conflict?
Well, let me try to say this without try to keep a lid on my personal opinions about both of those candidates. But let's just, Nikki Haley has always struck me as actually a kind of establishment neoconservative type who is much more concerned with her own political career than with anything else, quite frankly. I don't. She's never demonstrated to me that she is the kind of person that cannot be swayed, who will stick to a position and just you can move heaven and earth and you won't be able to get her to change her opinion. Her position. She's never struck me as someone who can do that. I think Ron DeSantis would be a stronger person to deal with this situation. Really, I think he's much more kind of no nonsense. This is what we need to do, and we're going to get it done. And I think former President Trump would handle it just as well, maybe, and perhaps better. But then again, I also think that this never would have happened if Trump was president right now. But that's just me.
Agreed.
But I'll say this, though. Here's the thing about dealing with the situation, and an American leader dealing with this situation is that they always seem to, their default position is always, well, I can make myself look good by going in there and negotiating peace, negotiating a ceasefire. Here's the thing. The Israelis, and I don't say this in a derogatory way, the Israelis are about the most stubborn people on the face of the planet when it comes to them defending their homes, and that's how it should be. And here's the thing: after what Hamas did, there is no chance that the Israelis are going to settle for any kind of ceasefire unless it's simply temporary ceasefires in order for people to leave or for hostages to be released, or little temporary ceasefires. But the Israelis are not going to agree to any kind of peace agreement until they have made Hamas pay for what they did. So any US leader or any US politician even who thinks they're going to go over there and kind of negotiate a peace, no, that's not going to happen, and they are going to fail. And then, of course, they'll look like a failure for doing so, because there will be no peace until Israel has exacted what it considers to be a proportional, revenge or response against Hamas.
Okay, Andrew, I'm going to bring you in on this one. Vivek Ramaswamy mean, he has charmed some people, and there's a little push and a following. But does he have a good enough grasp on foreign affairs to even be able to stand with the rest and discuss it? Or do you think he's capable of maybe rising a little bit over this?
Yeah, I saw this exact argument during both debates. Nikki Haley made the case and Mike Pence made the case. But this idea that somehow an inexperienced person is not suited for foreign policy is ridiculous. Here's a question. Have any of these experienced individuals in Washington or elsewhere crafted a terrific foreign policy? Yep. Just look at the Middle East over the last, let's say, 30 years or 20 years. The smartest men and women government created some of these terrorist groups today. Israel supported Hamas in this fight against the Fatah, another fundamentalist group in Palestine. Jimmy Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski armed and financed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in this fight against the Soviets. The Obama administration armed and trained extremist Syrian rebels in a fight against ISIS. So all these efforts have led to blowback in foreign policy. None of these people have done a good job. So, when you have a guy like Ramaswamy who has a more of a non-interventionist streak and says we should stay out of it, but, try to stand strong, I think that's more of a position that the American people would want. You look at throughout history, you asked Tim this question, and Dave, Richard Nixon, he was voted in to stop the war in Vietnam. George W. Bush, he said he wanted a humble foreign policy. He beats Al Gore. Obama, he trounced John McCain, the avid war hawk who wanted to bomb Iran. And Donald Trump, he was anti-war, and he was a lot more peaceful than Hillary Clinton, the quite hawkish Democrat. So you can't blame Ramaswamy or anybody else for wanting to advocate a non-interventionist foreign policy, considering the disastrous effects of the neoconservative agenda of the last 30-40 years. So President Trump, he had zero foreign policy experience. I'm sure Dave will agree with this. The geopolitical landscape was a lot calmer and peaceful than it is today.
Well, I think you can go back in history and see that most presidents, in fact, almost all of them, had no foreign policy experience per se. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who may be considered one of the most successful foreign policy presidents, he presided over essentially 2 wars. He was governor of New York. Mm-hmm. There's no foreign policy in New York, right? Ronald Reagan had no foreign policy experience, nor did Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or George W. Bush or Donald Trump or Barack Obama, for that matter. The only ones who have really are Joe Biden and George H.W. Bush back in the late 1980s. So the idea that you have to have traveled a lot, that you have to have experience, I think it's a misnomer. You need to understand the human condition. You need to understand what motivates leaders, how to appeal to them. Donald Trump had zero foreign policy experience, and yet he was able to sustain peace over 4 years in very complicated situations. So I don't think experience really is much of a factor when it comes to foreign policy. I think it's very overrated.
Well, experience is one thing if you have experience of solving problems, but yes. I can't remember who said it, but somebody said, can't remember who said this, but somebody said, Joe Biden has been wrong on every single foreign policy issue, pretty much throughout his career. And that's true. So, his, years of experience, what do they count for? When you've spent years getting something wrong, and then saying, well, this other person doesn't have any experience. I've had decades of experience, but when you're always wrong about something,
that's not exactly an advantage.
No. Might be experience, just not a skill set you want to promote. All right, guys, around the horn real quick. Do you think the conflict in the Mideast is going to benefit the GOP in general, or Donald Trump specifically, or not?
I say yes. A world at peace in the Trump administration stands in especially sharp contrast to the world under Biden, with hotspots all over the globe and 2 flat-out ground wars.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I'd say yes. I don't think it really benefits anyone, but I think it's better for, politically it's better for the GOP than for the Democrats, and specifically, I think you got to remember that. Look at coming back to these pro-Palestinian, essentially pro-Hamas demonstrations, that a certain element of the progressive left has really shown its true colors.
Yes.
In terms of being, this, again, condoning basically, or at least refusing to condemn, the slaughter of hundreds of civilians in the name of their kind of preferred political agenda. I think that's incredibly, and the more that goes on, the more damaging that is going to be to the Democrats.
I think that what you're looking at is that the Democrats are going to be the victims of optics. The Democrats have to answer for the debacle in Afghanistan. That is a lens through which everyone is going to see the Biden administration. And the optics here are that the world is ablaze with anti-American riots, all because of the fact that they see the American administration as being feckless and weak. And when you get that impression, you can anticipate that there's going to be a backlash around the world.
Andrew, from your perch in Canada, you might have a little different opinion. So what do you think?
It depends on who the nominee is. If it's Mike Pence and Nikki Haley and they're advocating for deploying troops to the region, I don't think that would benefit the Republican Party. But if you have, let's say, Donald Trump or Ramaswamy, who are advocating more of a diplomatic approach, not sending troops overseas, then I think that would benefit more the Republicans than the current administration's plan.
Well, I guess there you have it, people. When flames of war are fanned, Americans want a leader who can be forceful and fair, but not take any prisoners either. Thanks, panel. The Israeli and Palestinian war has renewed a call from Americans to close the U.S. southern border. Not only do refugees, drug cartels, and human traffickers find easy access points, but so do known suspected terrorists. According to a recent report by the House Judiciary Committee, more than 1.7 million known gotaways have evaded Border Patrol and escaped into the interior in the last 2 years. According to former Immigration Customs Enforcement Chief Tom Holman, quote, "If you don't think a single one of the gotaways is coming from a country that sponsors terrorism, then you're ignoring the data," end quote. In 2023, 659 known terrorist suspects were apprehended. Graham, so 1.7 million border crosses are unaccounted for. How vulnerable is the U.S. to another terrorist attack?
We're incredibly vulnerable. Of course, you have to, it's worth bearing in mind the fact that since 9/11, there hasn't actually been a major terrorist attack on American soil. And so that's a positive thing. Obviously, someone somewhere is doing something right, because these groups out there are always looking for ways to hit us. So that's a silver lining, if you like. But the thing is, these people coming across the border, obviously, it presents such a fantastic opportunity for our true adversaries, which is people like, I wouldn't say so much Russia necessarily, but China, Iran, North Korea, these people, and groups like Hezbollah and ISIS and Al Qaeda. Obviously, it's a fantastic opportunity for them to infiltrate into this country. The fact that we are allowing so many of these getaways, but even the people who are being maybe detained at the border and superficially questioned, and then given some vague court appearance date 2 or 3 years hence, and then told off you go, wherever you want to go in the country, have at it. even those people. So it's not just the gotaways. It's the people who are even being detected at the border and then released into the country. So we're talking about tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people, and among those there could be up to several thousand people who are here to do us harm. Now, we don't know yet, and then, of course, over a period of time, do you manage to infiltrate a whole terrorist cell into the country? A whole 6 people, 8 people, 10 people, or whatever, who are working together to coordinate some kind of major attack. So I think right now, and I'm, the libertarian in me hates the thought of us, becoming even more like a police state and a surveillance state. But unfortunately, until we get somebody in the White House who is actually willing to secure the southern border, particularly, and for that matter, even the northern border, because we got to watch, from people coming down from Andrew's part of the world to mess with us as well. Because, and I'm not talking about Canadians, I'm talking about actual other people who enter Canada and then come across the border. We shouldn't neglect the fact that the northern border is also potentially a problem. And until we get someone in the White House who's willing to actually do something to mitigate that issue, unfortunately, all of us have to be very much on our guard over the next, I would say, particularly over the next, year or so. This is an incredibly dangerous time, potentially.
Well, since you threw the ball at Andrew, I'm going to follow up with that. We're all focused on the southern border because it's just so chaotic down there. But apparently, most of the known suspected terrorist subjects have come through Canada. Andrew, explain your country. What's going on?
So a couple of things. So first, there's a country road between Quebec and New York. It's called Roxham Road. Around 50,000 people have illegally crossed this thruway in the last 2 years. Second, if you look at the data between 2017 and 2023, Border Patrol arrests of individuals on terror watch lists at the U.S.-Canada border has been more common. Now, why is this happening? Well, there's a few reasons for this. First, Canada under Justin Trudeau is welcoming everyone in the country now. If you look at the population growth, we topped 40 million last year. Why is that? 98% of the growth in this country has been through foreigners. So you have, asylum seekers, refugees, permanent residents, legal immigration, all that stuff. So these individuals, they might not be terrorists, but they could be friends or family members considered associates of those who could be linked to terrorist entities. And they don't even have to be Hamas or Al Qaeda. They could be, guerrilla rebel groups, other terrorist entities. This country right now, it's especially the major urban centers, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Ottawa. They're all just, the streets are paved with refugees and asylum seekers. They have nowhere to go. They're on streets, and I'm very sure, because how incompetent this government is, I'm sure many of the odious individuals seep through the cracks. And there's a lot of talk about how a lot of people went north through Roxham Road into Canada, but if they can go through north, I'm sure a lot of them go through south too. So all the resources, well, I guess I'll use that word lightly, are being poured into the U.S.-Mexico border, but as Graham said, you're eventually going to have to start focusing on what's happening north. We're not just shipping double Tim Hortons. We could be, shipping also unscrupulous individuals.
Dave, what about the attacks on Jews and Arabs? I mean, that seems to be ramping up again. Like, right after 9/11, everybody was targeting anybody that looked different. So, what's going on there? How do we fix that? Or how do we even address that?
Well, I think in this case, you have more Jewish synagogues that are being attacked than Arab mosques. And it's simply because of the false narrative that's being pushed, particularly around the explosion that took place in the Baptist hospital in Gaza, and those who would want to do U.S. and Israel harm pick that up right away, but unfortunately they're wrong, and it was a false narrative in that the terrorists in Gaza couldn't get their instructions correct on their rockets, and they themselves caused the explosion that was really terrible. But I think that what we're also kind of having to deal with here is there have been a significant increase in the amount of Chinese that have come through our southern border, about which we know very little. And they are also, you can assume they're among those that got away. And lately, we've had a lot of spying going on from China about the United States. So, getting back to one of the things we've talked about, and we're having to deal with the world on a number of fronts. Most recently, obviously, Hamas attack on Israel, but because it is so heinous, we can't forget that we have a lot of other enemies that are wishing us harm, and you've got to keep your eye on the ball just about everywhere. And of course, it doesn't help when you have terrorist sympathizers in your own Congress.
That's true. Tim,
Yes.
can we shut the barn door after the cows got out? Or, have we just opened Pandora's box?
Well, I think that, you're not going to be able to put the horse back in the barn as long as we're using farmyard metaphors. But you've got to deal with what you're faced with. And right now, the Biden administration is faced with a world that is aflame, and their emotions and their passions are directed against the United States and Israel. But we can't forget that we have other enemies in Russia and China, as well as Iran and North Korea.
Okay, I really want to hear from our now Big Daddy, Tim Donner. You've been in this game for a very long time, probably almost as long as Dave and me. I don't know, but I'm at a loss here, but I know you can kind of round out what an open border means in this time of uncertainty.
Well, no one ever said that this experiment known as the United States of America was going to be easy. And, one of the basic conundrums in this situation is that we are a people who has welcomed those who are oppressed. That's what we're all about. And yet at the same time, we've become so attractive as a destination. You can see it by the millions that are dying to get into the country just through the southern border, that we become such an attractive destination that we've had trouble knowing how to limit this. And so we have tried various things such as border walls. And while many people support Donald Trump's border wall, we can also see that's not an answer to anything. Hamas breached the most famous border wall in the world, the one separating them, Gaza from Israel. They breached it in 25 places. So a physical wall is not enough by itself either. I think what you have to do is make it so that it's not attractive to come to the United States. There aren't going to be any benefits. There is no welfare available for people who enter the country illegally. You cannot stop people physically because they will always try to come over. But you can stop them with what you call a paywall, which is you come here, you don't get paid. You go past the wall, you don't get paid, period. And that will have the greatest impact on the flood of people through our border. But I can't help again but notice that as soon as Donald Trump left office and Joe Biden stepped in, that it wasn't a matter of days or weeks before Putin started massing his troops on the Ukrainian border. A lot of this is the perception of Joe Biden, his weakness and his inability to stand up to the many evil forces in the world that threaten the United States. And I think this election is going to be a referendum on whether people believe. There's a lot of things that are in play in this election, but I think part of it's going to be the simple formulation, which people didn't think about as much in 2020. Which of these candidates, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, can keep us safe? That might be the ultimate issue. in the 2024 election.
Well, in a time of uncertainty, perhaps on the brink of a global war, Americans need less division and more of the United States of America. We'll keep you informed. Thanks, panel. That's it for our Conservative 5 panel today. Check out our other C5 shows and segments on your favorite video platform: YouTube, Vimeo, Rumble. We're on them all. I'm your host, Sarah Cowgill. Thanks for joining us today for Free Thinking, Free Speech, LibertyNation.com.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at LibertyNation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.